Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us to hear Dr. Eyler this morning. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Kaiser Marston, also. And as always, if you have questions, please use the chat feature, and Dr. Eyler will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Dr. Eyler?
Thanks, Vicki, and thanks everybody for coming today, and I hope everybody's safe and healthy and how crazy it's been in California the last month and a half. Today, I'm going to talk to you about where we're at with respect to the macroeconomy and generally speaking, where we might be going. There's a lot of consternation as we go toward the fall and winter for multiple reasons between the election and a potential resurgence of cases. I'm going to talk about some of that. I'm going to talk about how some of the forecasts have not really priced in or has, let's say, got into yet any potential real upswing in cases, but we will see how things go in terms of the forecast as we roll forward. So let's just think about where we're at in terms of jobs. For the US, we're at 8.4% unemployment after seasonal adjustments, still about 10.25 million people out of work that had a job last August. California is down to 11.4% unemployment in terms of seasonally adjusted data, with over 2 million people still out of work from last year. Well, that's still a lot of people out of work. So even though you're hearing a lot of news, especially from your president, about how this has been an amazing economic recovery, I have been talking for months, and if you've seen this multiple times, about a so-called modified V. Well, thinking about a so-called modified V is that we should have expected kind of a snapback. The key is whether or not we get through the next 6 months or so with continued economic recovery. And to a certain extent, forecasts, as I'll show you in a minute, suggest that. But how the forecasts are going to evolve is a big thing going forward. Part of that is really what's going to happen over the next few months. So we're still waiting to see what Congress is going to do with another round of potential fiscal funding under some iteration of the so-called HEALS Act, which will augment the CARES Act that happened in March and April. The election has not turned into total financial craziness yet, but we have to expect that the equity markets are going to start reacting, and there could be some volatility short term in interest rates, though that maybe is more unlikely. The key is actually just watching to see how business and consumer confidence move through October, November, and December, where we're going to have a lot of potential change coming one way or the other. We're still watching housing specific to California, and this is key because we have not really seen much of a housing wobble yet. And historically in recession, we do have some housing give back while job losses are relatively high. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but it's something we're watching creeping forward. Part of that's because we've had deferments on mortgage payments. We know that there's some latent foreclosures sitting in the market, and whether or not the jobs market and the economic recovery more generally can turn the corner fast enough to allow for some continued positive foundation for the housing market is an open question. I'll talk about, like I said, in a minute. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the labor force, because the labor force has been one of the very tricky parts of the labor data that we want to watch closely as it evolves over the next few months. Well, folks, just as a reminder, recovery works once you feel like you've troughed. We need businesses to stabilize and have them start rehiring, and the two start to feed positively off each other in what we would call a virtuous cycle. And what that can do, at least generally, is stabilize what otherwise could be destabilized housing markets and labor markets. So we need businesses and workers to get back to work in general and start to feed positively off of each other with respect to businesses rehiring, those rehired workers starting to spend, supporting the businesses, and then we kind of get back into the normal economic groove. One or a couple caveats is that we may see some labor force shifts. Where we work, how we work has already taken place, but we may see a speed up of movement toward more automation, and that's something to watch in terms of whether or not we're actually going to get hiring back in full, or if some industries are in fact going to go through structural change and not have as many people rehired. Here's the latest estimate of GDP, and this is over the last now 4 recessions. This is from 1990 forward on a quarterly basis. You can see on the far right-hand shaded area, the 4th shaded area moving left to right, we saw the deepest dive in post-World War II history with respect to the quarterly movement of GDP. Now, 2 caveats on that. One is that this is in a totally different time per normal recession. Even the Great Recession, which is the 3rd shaded area from left to right, had relatively negative movements, but nothing with the speed and magnitude that we've seen in this recession. And a lot of that's because in the Great Recession, we shut off very few parts of the economy that just weren't working right from a market standpoint. This time we actually shut the economy off, and that's why that number is so negative. Now, the cool thing is like any other natural disaster, you might have a negative quarter where things were really tenuous and shut off because of the natural disaster. But then the next quarter, because of an infusion of new resources and really just an awakening or reawakening of the economy, we should see some pickup. Well, that's exactly what forecasters are expecting in the third quarter, which ends in 10 days. We're going to see some real change here. But these forecasters are, the Philadelphia Fed does a survey basically of 40 forecasters every quarter. And this is their latest as of about a month ago. These forecasters were not that far off from quarter two in May. So they were predicting about 32% negative in GDP for the second quarter. That was very close to the truth at this point. We feel like it might just exactly land on that. So we do respect these 40 forecasters. This is the middle of their forecast, or the so-called median. The unemployment rate path, as you'll see in a minute, is a little bit more pessimistic than it was in the previous quarter, at least going forward toward 2023. But the real key here, folks, and this is maybe the most critical piece of news, and I've said this, I think, last time too, is that we should not expect full economic recovery until at least 2022, and probably more conservatively till 2023. And the rationale behind that is that businesses are probably going to be somewhat reticent to rehire in full, at least over the next 6 months, which elongates this episode through the first or second quarter of 2021. And if we start to really turn the ship around in mid, or let's say the third quarter of 2021, it won't be 2022 or 2023 before we really see the fruit of recovery. And in some ways, it's exactly what we saw in the Great Recession once policy had come to bear on the situation and we really started to get around the housing problem. In this case, we need to get around the social policy concerns and expectation of a potential second shutdown if we don't have a vaccine. So now we're really kind of almost in a disease watch to see what happens with cases come October, November, December, and into the early part of 2021. However, over the next few quarters, these forecasters don't see a huge change coming in such a way that it would really upset the economy. So you'll see 19.1% positive growth in the third quarter, followed by 5.8 and 5.2 as 2021 unfolds, and then relatively normal-ish growth going toward the end of the year in 2021, with unemployment slowly sliding down past 10%, down toward 9, down towards 8. We're already at 8.4 on a seasonally adjusted basis. And in some ways, these forecasters are expecting a little bit of a pickup come fall and early winter, but then we're going to keep on going through 2021. And a lot of the basic assumptions here are that these forecasters see a vaccine coming in 2021, and that otherwise we're going to make business adjustments to where we're going to want to get back to more of a normal economy. And notice, though, that we're not going to zoom back to 4% unemployment at the national level. Over the next few years, while this year will be a negative growth year, which is totally expected given how the second quarter and the first quarter went, we should expect moderate but positive growth the next few years. Now, the key is that look at that it's going to be relatively moderate. You don't see +6, +7% growth over the entire year in 2021 through 2023. It's going to be somewhat slow and low. So that modified V, where there's an initial quick pop up after the sharp decline, but then some flattening out toward a fully recovered economy, is looking more and more likely. And the unemployment rate movement over the next few years kind of confirms that with these forecasters. They're not expecting to go from 10% unemployment to 4% unemployment within a 6 or 8 month period. Even though you're hearing some rhetoric around that in political circles, don't expect that. Economies usually don't work like that, especially when there's still a large amount of uncertainty left to be resolved in the macroeconomy. The biggest labor data we're watching now are what's called continued unemployment insurance claims. And these are the total number of weeks that unemployment insurance is being paid in the American economy and also for California. And so you'll see here, there's the US movement. And what we really want to see is a continued downward gradient in these data, with the idea that you're going to get a little bit of pop as you go into recession. And we see that this is from January forward to about 10 days ago. You'll see that movement up. These weekly data then peak in early May and have been slowly sliding down ever since. But the key, folks, is the following. Notice the slow slide. And notice on the left-hand side with the blue colored numbers that we're not talking about 500,000 people, a couple million people out of work. We're talking still about 13 million people who are being paid unemployment insurance. So we're watching very closely the evolution of these data, because we need these to continue to slide down. And the faster they slide down, the more growth we're going to see in the economy. The sort of slow, flat downward movement is good, but it suggests, again, a modified V. If you flip this over, and make it upside down, you kind of start to see how the economy is recovering and the so-called shape of that recovery. Here's California in contrast, and California has not recovered as well as the US. So this corroborates that difference between the unemployment rates we just saw, where California had a quick pop up, some violence in the data in the middle of May, and then unfortunately really kind of flat movement over most of the summer, where in different parts we actually popped up. And if you notice, that trend is not necessarily flattened or gone down, it's actually picked up just a hair. And part of that's because we closed part of the economy again in the summer. And unfortunately, we haven't quite recovered from that just yet. So we've had more people enter unemployment than go off, and that's what increases the number of weeks being paid. So that's a critical factor for California. We need these data to start heading down in earnest and in trend. Another piece of data to watch is consumer confidence. And these data, unfortunately, lag about 6 weeks. And in times like this, that lag is normally not that big of a deal, but in times like this, it is unfortunately something that we have to wait and see what the surveys show. There are other surveys that suggest that consumers have also become less confident over the last couple of months. You'll notice that these data that come out of the University of Michigan in their so-called survey of consumer sentiment fall quickly as we go into recession. The shaded areas are the last two recessions on this graph. This is from 2000 forward on a monthly basis. And then they rise during growth, even though it's a little hard to see that going up. But you'll notice the trend, at least from the Great Recession, the big shaded part in the middle, they've gone up. Consumers are fickle by their nature, but if they trend up in terms of confidence, that's a good thing. That quick slide on the far right-hand side was then in June picked up a little bit, which was good. But then in July, it slid back down a bit. Now, how much of this is a function of either cases rising in certain states and then reducing consumer confidence because maybe the consumers lost their job again? The California data showcase this. But whether or not they're worried more now about the election results and election uncertainty and becoming less and less confident that the economy is going to provide an environment for rehiring or just an augmentation of their income and hence their consumption profile over the next few months is potentially what's weighing on consumers. The August and September numbers will be somewhat telling as whether or not we're getting sort of a trended movement back up from the original downturn in this, or we're going to be flat for a little while. And again, folks, one little caveat here, consumer confidence surveys are really surveying almost teenagers in some ways, that, you know, there'll be one thing one week that'll affect them and the next week you'll see something else affect them. And sometimes it's tricky to take these without a grain of salt, but what the University of Michigan's team has done over time is really refine this to be very, very clear about what they're asking the consumer. And it's, as you can see here, it is very much the shaping of recovery and recession over the last at least 20 years. And it's true going back in time as well. So we're watching how consumers react very closely. On Friday, on the 21st of August, the Bureau of Labor Statistics released its data at the state and county level. And we're going to see a little bit more on this at the state level in a minute. But this map of the United States shows where there's still some relative hotspots of unemployment. For the US, again, 8.4%, California, 11.4%, New York, a little higher than California, Illinois, a little bit lower than California, but I want to stop there. The darker colored states on this map are ones that are still relatively high vis-a-vis the state or the national average of unemployment in other states. Notice the light colored states, Utah, Idaho, Nebraska. These states have relatively low, almost pre-COVID levels of unemployment. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about this right at the end, but we're watching labor force to see how many people are truly out there looking for work. Nevada's still at 13.2, which is actually the highest, unfortunately, in the United States. And remember, these are not self-employed workers counted here. These are just payroll counted. Let's look at some big portions of California now. This is now not seasonally adjusted because the other data around the counties are not seasonally adjusted. Notice Los Angeles is 16.6% as of August, the second highest in California. San Francisco, San Diego, Sacramento, all under 10% now, which is good. Seasonally adjusted, they're probably a little lower than that. So it suggests that there's some really good things happening in parts of California, but in short, it's still pretty, they're still relatively high. And part of that is, notice the labor force percentage change is still relatively high, somewhere north of 2 to 2.5, upwards to 4% in San Francisco of the labor force that was in play in August. And unfortunately, I have this mislabeled. It should be August 2019 to 2020. But the point is that the labor force is still relatively negative, which is a problem overall for how many people are still out there looking for work, but have really just not re-entered the labor force. If you look at the California economy and what sectors have still been most affected, I'm going to walk you relatively quickly from April through August. This was the beginning of the problem, and this was the so-called trough of the problem. Notice total farm and non-farm. This is where we think we kind of bottomed out in California, and then we started to grow more quickly. So this is the percentage change in jobs by industry sector from the previous year. This is as of August, but this is April through August and sort of progressing, showing recovery. July was a little bit of a give back, and then there's August. So August also was somewhat of a give back, and this has got people nervous in California that there's certain industries out there, agriculture, personal service businesses that were rolled back, government that's now starting to see some job losses. Whether those act as a continued drag on California's economy is an open question, but leisure and hospitality has recovered relatively well now as we've started to open the economy back up, and other parts of the economy are showing growth. So this is why you're seeing unemployment slide a little bit in California overall, but there are still some concerned sectors out there regardless of the growth. Now, just quickly looking at county maps, I'm going to show you a contrast. This is the August map of the counties and where unemployment is most severe. The more red counties here are ones that are having severe unemployment concerns, where the lighter colored and really the green are sort of transitioning from poor conditions to better conditions. Green is best. Notice that on the February map on the right-hand side, most of the counties in California are green or lightly colored, very few red. Well, now if you look on the other map again on August, you'll notice that some of the counties, specifically in Northern California above Sacramento and more rural, are not that far away from where we were in February, and suggesting that the more rural California counties have had a little easier time economically through this. And if you look more deeply at the data across the 58 counties, that seems to be holding true. We will see if that continues. That's something to watch as we go forward, but this gives you a real snapshot, depending on where you are in California, of where there's still some concerns with respect to the labor market. Thinking about housing for a minute, one of the things that I've been looking at is listing prices and not just median home prices. So here's Los Angeles, here's California. So believe it or not, even though Los Angeles has relatively high unemployment, the housing prices that people are asking for when they list their homes for sale, so think of this as a supply price of homes, what people are asking for their homes when they put them up for sale, have been rising since May, which suggests that we're having a frothy housing market right now, and sellers are relatively confident to list their homes higher than what was being listed the month before. This is in stark contrast to San Francisco and San Mateo counties. The Bay Area is seeing some concerns and able to hold on to their housing value. Why? Supply is exceeding demand. Here's Fresno and here's Sacramento for somewhat flatter growth, but still, if you looked at those areas specifically, you'd see a pickup. But you're seeing a serious contrast between the higher price areas of California, specifically in the Bay Area, and other parts of California initially in this recession. And whether or not that holds or not across California be an intriguing piece. But it's interesting to see that contrast, because we are hearing stories of people leaving the Bay Area, leaving Los Angeles, and also San Diego a little bit, but also somewhat transitioning back where the deals are now getting a little bit better. And I think you're seeing some confidence by sellers in certain areas versus others. Looking at median home price growth, this is really where you're seeing some wild contrasts. But the good thing is that these numbers remain positive. So this is from August 2019 to August 2020 is the blue, and the red is from August 2018 to August 2020. So notice that generally speaking, the COVID-19 effects on the housing market when a deal is done. So this is the post-sale median price of homes, and the percentage change from 1 year previous is positive. We haven't really seen any erosion of these values, which suggests that the supply prices we just saw are working themselves out in terms of actual final demand, and we want to see this continue. So one of the critical factors here is that this is true across California, even though there's some episodic issues. So for example, if you notice Alameda County, Contra Costa County are lower. The Bay Area generally has seen less percentage growth in prices than other parts of California, except for Santa Clara County, which is a wild housing market in terms of the roller coastering since 2017. It's going up and down and all over the place. But Central California, as well as other parts of California, are still kind of seeing steady growth in housing prices, regardless of the recession activity. Now, again, I want to say this, because what I'm about to show you is the current forecast by Zillow going toward August 2021, which is very positive. What is creating this? Two things. One is that the creation of it is that stock prices are relatively high, which means people are looking for other investment vehicles and demand is there, and interest rates are relatively low right now. So you're seeing people moving from rental to home purchases because the cost of credit has gone down. Now, unfortunately, there's not a lot of vacancy, which suggests that prices are relatively stable downward for the time being, and that's going to create some more affordability problems going forward over time. The critical factor, folks, is this, is a lot of what's behind this, though, unfortunately, is some shadow delinquencies that have been held off due to mortgage deferments. And ultimately, there's a shadow foreclosures unless the economy turns around and allows those folks who are close to the edge to remain in their home. If they cannot do that, you're going to see a real surge in supply, and then you're going to finally see what normally happens in recession as a downturn in home prices. But for right now, Zillow, who has the most robust forecast data out there that's available to the public, shows that there's really no place in California that's seeing any real contraction going forward one full year. San Francisco, which is the far right-hand side, and if you see this, hopefully you can pick out your own county here. I made that font as big as I could and still capture all 58 counties and the state. The state's on the far left-hand side, a 5% forecasted increase over the 1 year. San Francisco's 2.8%, so lower generally, but still all positive. So what's this suggest? It suggests right now the economists at Zillow and housing forecasters and economists across California are seeing basically the same thing, that through next year we're looking pretty good, but so much of it depends on how we see consumer and business confidence continue to rise over time, if it's going to rise, and ultimately what that means in terms of affecting homeowners and their decision to stay in their homes. So watch for that. The housing market for right now is stable, but there's still some large concerns that we're going to have some snapback effects once deferments end, if the economy is not turned around and shown enough positive momentum to keep people in their homes. I want to talk about labor force briefly. This is kind of a wild data set at the national level because this is a somewhat unprecedented recession in terms of the way people transitioned out of their jobs. This is temporary layoffs, meaning that people went into unemployment insurance with the idea that they did not permanently lose their jobs. They lost it on a temporary basis. Notice, this is from 1994 on a monthly basis. This is at the national level. Generally speaking, temporary layoffs are a small portion of job losses. Here's permanent losses. Notice, the Great Recession is very obvious here, but let me snap back one piece. That spike at the far right-hand side suggests how many people lost their jobs. And then notice that it starts to trail down because the number of people that are still unemployed we're starting to hire people back, mainly from those that were temporarily unemployed. But there's the permanent job losers. And this is a place where once you lose your job permanently, it means either A, there's no expectation your employer is going to hire you back, and there's no expectation, for example, that your former employer is even going to survive and have an ability to hire you back. So that's now starting to dominate the number of people unemployed. This is those that have completed temporary jobs and have simply just lost their job because it no longer exists from a temporary basis. This is people that have quit. This is people that have re-entered the labor force and not yet have a job. And this is people that are just now entering the job market. So what is very critical to recognize, and this is why you're hearing forecasts that sound relatively positive, is that the bulk of people that are still unemployed are temporarily laid off. It suggests that those folks can more easily come back than permanent job losers or brand new entrants into the labor force, or those that have quit, which are the normal recession movements. Notice from 1994 forward, you can see the dot-com recession and the Great Recession very obviously in these data where the temporary layoffs are not that big of a deal. I'm going to take you back real quick again. Check out that spike. That is one of the reasons why you're having, in some cases, relatively robust forecasts out there for the US economy, because if we started to hire a lot of the temporary workers back, we'd probably see some quick growth. But the idea that we piled on even more people unemployed is starting to concern economists in terms of true recovery. And you can see all those there. So folks, what to watch as we creep closer to 2021? Those labor market changes are critical. We need recovery in labor markets to really get moving, but we also need businesses to remain stable. The fall and the winter is where we're going to really turn the corner on this thing. And until we get through that, the uncertainty remains. We have a presidential election that's more and more uncertain seemingly every day of the week. The forecasts I showed you earlier have not priced in what I would consider to be another shelter-in-place episode or a real spike in cases in the US or globally, but those might change depending on what the evolution is of the epidemiology. Will those mortgage deferments start to show their face in a rising home supply because people no longer get the deferments and have to start putting their houses up because their jobs haven't come back? Those are all gigantic questions as we get closer to 2021 and the true recovery of the American economy. And folks, I've talked about this, if you've been on this thing a few times, the depth and duration of this episode is really the key, like every other recession, and policy has done an amazing amount, but you're going to hear a lot about congressional debates of how much more can they really do, And how do you start trading off the short for the long term? And you're seeing that sort of back and forth going on between the Democrats and the Republicans, and you're probably going to see it through the presidential election and beyond. We'll see if we get a deal done. But folks, it's one way or the other, we're going to have to start reckoning with these choices. And if it doesn't start to do a whole lot for the American economy as we get toward fall and winter, there's going to be a lot of questions asked about what really more could be done, or we're just going to have to wait. And that elongates the duration of this episode. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Vicki. Thank you so much again for coming to this today. And I want to thank Chabon and Kaiser Marston for their support. Vicki, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Okay, excuse me, one question I have is the, which I think you've just answered. So the forecasts, like from the Philadelphia Feds, that's just going to be completely different if in fact we go or see another surge like they're claiming is happening in Europe, correct?
Oh, absolutely. So, and the key, Vicki, is this, is that it really depends on the surge and our ability to adjust to it. So don't think that a short-term uptick in cases is necessarily going to change forecast. It really is if we see an unprecedented surge or a trended surge that we are not solving easily. That's when you're going to start to see forecasts get a little bit more, let's say, pessimistic, but you're also going to probably see equity markets change first. That will start to give forecasters the thought that, okay, well, maybe businesses are going to be less confident as we go into the first of the year, and we need to ratchet some of these original forecasts back down a little bit. So the key is really the speed and how long it takes to get us turned back around the corner. And this is what's got some people nervous, that some of these forecasts are a little too optimistic given what might happen as we get into fall and winter, especially with the dual threat of regular flu and COVID-19 resurgence.
Right. And I think the other thing that you didn't mention, which is hard to see how it plays into everything, is the combination of COVID and the fire situation throughout California and most of the West.
So you could say that part of the slowdown in California is fire related on top of being COVID related. And that would, and the only reason I'm saying that may or may not be true is because the funny thing about fires is it can suddenly employ a bunch of people who weren't otherwise employed, but it's an industrial shift from one industry to another. So it can also slow down business hiring. And so there's a short-term kind of, quasi positive effect, but the medium term could be that it actually slows down what would have been recovery momentum otherwise.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it looks like Isabel has a question. Isabel, I'm going to let you unmute yourself if you'd like and go ahead and ask your question.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Dr. Eyler. Early on, you showed a slide of the change in GDP, and what we're going through right now is so stark. And I was wondering, had you gone back all the way to the Great Depression just to see how this compares?
Yes. So in fact, economists ran back there almost immediately when they started to see forecasts in the -30 range. And this is beyond the Great Recession the Great Depression in terms of the contraction in GDP. But I want to be careful saying that, because remember that in the early 1930s, the construction of our economy was so much different than it is now. We are in a much more resilient, more technologically advanced economy. The difference in the Great Depression is that market forces came to bear on our economy and turned it into a really large recession that was exacerbated by poor policy. In this case, we actually chose socially to turn off our economy. And as we turned it back on, we brought an enormous positive amount of policy to bear that has learned a lot of lessons since the Great Depression. So it looks on the surface of the same magnitude, but the speed and what we've brought to bear on this is so much different than the Depression. Don't make that comparison in your mind. They are two completely different episodes in so many ways, but the magnitude of the changes are somewhat similar in terms of the unemployed and also the income contractions, but they're coming from two different places.
Okay, thanks.
Of course. Vicki, are there any other questions?
I do not see any other questions. We will have the recording up on the Chabon website a little bit later on today. So if you want to take another look at it, it will be there for you. I think we are good. Thank you again, Dr. Eyler. Appreciate all the information and guidance that you're providing us.
Thanks, folks, for coming today.